Welcome to the North Toronto STEM Club presentation of the history and the spirit of Berlin reflected in its stems. Just a position where Berlin is. This is a map of Berlin, of Germany, showing the outlines and the borders of 1937, plus the different zones that were established after World War II. So the dark line is the border between East and West Germany. The Soviet zone is this here, and there's also a part that became then part of Poland, and Eastern Prussia, which was divided between Russia and Poland. Berlin is here like an island in the Soviet zone. If you wonder about the purple area here, this is as far as the American forces, or rather the Western Allies, advanced, and eventually, because of the Conference of Yalta, were granted to the Soviets after the war. Well, in Berlin, from 1945 to 1990, because it was located entirely within the Soviet zone, and because of its symbolic importance, and that it was the seat of the former Nazi government, the city of Berlin was jointly occupied by the Allied forces and subdivided into 4 sectors. Berlin, this is a coat of arms of Berlin, and it reflects the idea that it has something to do with a bear, but it was actually a Slavic word that is at the origin of the word Berlin, or in Germany called Berlin. And Berlin is reflects rather the meaning of the Slavic word swamp or marsh, or maybe a dry spot in the wetlands. So it's not exactly anything to do with a bear. It's a very simple explanation. Anyways, the first ruler of the area where Berlin eventually was founded was Albrecht der Bär. He was the first German ruler, and maybe that had something to do with that it was associated with a bear. Now you will find this coat of arms and the bear in many other stamps too. Here, for example, are the ones that were issued after the surrender in May 1945. And you have them here marked with Stadt Berlin, the city of Berlin, and very symbolic. Here you see the ruin in the background and somebody with a spade. Here a wall, rather rebuilding, in this case, of the city. Somebody here with a board. And some of the stamps were then also used within the Soviet zone. So in this case, actually, these stamps here, the one in Stadt Berlin, was used in Brandenburg, which is a surrounding area of Berlin. And this one is a common issue for all occupied zones. But here it's also with an overprint, Sowjetische Besatzungszone, a Soviet occupation zone. Another map, Berlin, and here you see on the right what is an East Berlin. In green there was a Soviet zone, the French zone, the British, and the American. Here's Tempelhof. Another airport later during the airlift was built here in the French zone. That's Tegel, that's today's Berlin airport, and a smaller airport in the British zone in Gatow. Berlin had 20 boroughs at the time, less today. There were some amalgamations. 12 out of those 20 became then part of the Russian zone. Now, this is more a picture of the center of Berlin. This line would be where the wall was built. This is border between the Soviet zone and the Western Allied zone. And these were, once the wall was built, were actually crossing points. Now, at the beginning, Berliners could not go into East Berlin. And only checkpoint Charlie was open for anybody. And at the time, the Allies could use it to go at any time. That's their right. The Western Allies could go into the Soviet zone, and actually, theoretically, the Soviets could also access the West. Now, I circled a few points here to mark. This one here is where my playground was in the east, and I was born in the west. This Bernholmer Strasse is where November 9, 1989, the first breach of the wall occurred. And so that was very close to my home at the time. Now, I was not living then anymore in Berlin, so I didn't witness it. This area here is one many pictures were taken of. There's later another picture in regards to the wall, the Bernauer Strasse. Friedrichstrasse was the rail, subway and light transit rail station where you could access East Berlin, but it's only, you had to travel there by subway or the light rail. And then there was a check, like a really severe, some control point. Anyways, a few dates which become clearer also later on with some of the stamps I'm talking about. First of all, here Berlin was mentioned only the first time in 1244. So it was a rather new city, because by then other cities in Germany were already over 1,000 years old. For example, Trier or Regensburg, Augsburg, dozens and dozens of places. 1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War, which the war was very important in the area because it emptied more or less the province. So Berlin actually lost half its population in that war. Now, mind you, at the time, at the end of the war, the population of Berlin was 8,000. 1701, finally, Prussia became a kingdom. Before it was just a province of the empire. And that was Frederick I. Frederick II, also referred as Frederick the Great, was in the later half of the 18th century. It was rather important because he kind of established Prussia as political and military power. And also he enlarged the area to a large degree. 1871, eventually the whole German Empire came to an end with Napoleon's rule, and then the founding of the German Empire in 1871, which made Berlin again the capital. That empire came to an end after World War I, followed then by the ascent of the Nazi regime in 1933, and which again led into the end in May, in Berlin, May 1st of 1945. Now, in 1948 was then the introduction of the Deutschmark, which had an important impact because the Soviets didn't like it, which led them to the Berlin Airlift, which was going on for about a year, where all road access to Berlin was blockaded. Now, 53, there were riots in East Berlin and in East Germany. Eventually, in 1961, in August 1961, was the infamous Berlin Wall built, which was not just a wall, but also a very large fence all along the entire border between East and West Germany. And November 1989, starting in the Bonhoeffer Strasse, the wall came down and ended with the unification in October 1990. Now, the Währungsreform, or the introduction of the Deutschmark, had an impact because, as I said, the Soviets would have preferred one currency, and also it just meant that their political influence over all of Germany was diminished. They blockaded all the road access, and the Western Allies provided then the airlift, where every few seconds or almost every minute a plane was landing in Berlin. That's when the Tegel airport was built in record time. And those were the three corridors here where the planes could fly, from the British zone, the American zone down here, and then down here the French zone. And this is just a picture at the time how the Brandenburg Gate looked like. This stamp, it's actually a stamp, a Steuermarke. It's 2 Pfennig surtax on every piece of mail that was mailed in West Germany. It was to support exactly this airlift, so to provide the funds, because everything had to be airlifted. Coal for heating, potatoes, food, anything and everything. So after all, there were about 2 million people living by then in West Germany, West Berlin, rather. Now this stamp, there is a study group around in Germany, and there's quite a variety. The Scott catalog lists only, I think, 8 items, and not that expensive. I think the most expensive one is $20. But I've seen also a catalog in Germany where there's one for 100 euros. So they're not to be overlooked. One example of a postcard where the Steuermarke, or this surtax, was missing, the Steuermarke fehlt, tax, the stamp missing. It was required. This was a letter mailed in Germany, in West Germany, and to somebody in West Germany. So it was not just applying to people in Berlin. The Brandenburg Gate was an earlier picture and is very iconic for Berlin. You have it on so many stamps. Now this one is from West Germany. This one is from Berlin, and this one from East Germany. But the symbol of the Brandenburg Gate was used everywhere. Brandenburg, by the way, is a town west of Berlin, a small town. However, the province around Berlin is called Mark Brandenburg. So it refers to Brandenburg. Another example of the Brandenburg Gate, in this case, was for propaganda purposes. Issued, this was from way back in 1933, commemorating the ascent of Hitler when he became chancellor. Here's a picture of Hindenburg. He was a president at the time, and he appointed Hitler as chancellor. He was seen as an interim leader, something because they couldn't agree on any other party leader. At the time, it was a large party. He had maybe 18% of the popular vote, and Hindenburg anointed him, and then the Nazis just simply took over. Now this led eventually to the downfall of Germany, and also this is now a picture taken in 1945, shortly after the war. And here's, for example, a picture of Stalin. This is looking east from the top of the Brandenburg Gate. In the background, you see the city hall of Berlin. It's called Unter den Linden, so under the linden trees. Most of the linden trees were obviously destroyed, and the rest would go into the ovens in the winter of 1945, because it would be very severe and everything was just all the trees were cut down to provide firewood. Now, one picture of Berlin, here Deutsche Bundespost Berlin, also had the head of the statue that's on top of the chariot, which is on the Brandenburg Gate. And so the Brandenburg Gate was begun in 1788 and completed in 1791. So well over 200 years ago. And it's a small miracle that it's still surviving after so many years. And this is actually just another little map that shows where the Brandenburg Gate is located in 1772. And that was right at the edge of town. At that time, Berlin had about 120, 130,000 inhabitants. That's really the core of Berlin. For the record, this used to be Köln at one point, Köln with a C. And to the left here is a Tiergarten. Anyways, in 1772, later the population grew much to be much larger. So in 1871, at 800,000 people, and in 1925, 4 million. Again here, the political background that 4 occupying powers had the privileges throughout Berlin, but they didn't have the same for the rest of Germany. So the first stamps of the political entity Berlin were overprints on German stamps. So these were issued on September 3rd, 1948. And these are issues from 1959. Definitives in West Germany were also replicated in Berlin, except they showed then Berlin. So you have Deutsche Bundespost Berlin versus Deutsche Bundespost. So just to point out that this number, Scott 7993, was produced with 1.3 million, while the West Berlin issue was only issued with 48,500. So quite a difference. And most definitives had a similar run, that there were the millions in West Germany, and the Berlin issues were more in the tens of thousands. Here's an example of some stamps that were used in West Germany. Well, here is used in BRD, stands for Federal Republic of Germany, Bundesrepublik Deutschland. And you have here Deutsche Bundespost Berlin, all 3 stamps, and were mailed from West Germany to a place in East Germany. Now the Berlin Airlift, this picture here is probably well known. And as I said, planes came in constantly, and the nickname of those planes in German was Rosinenbomber, raisin bombers. So that photo also was then used in 1998 to commemorate 50 years of the airlift in the US. And I think it's a well done picture. Here is another example of a cover mailed this time from Berlin, and it asked people to buy from the blockaded city. So here's an enlargement. It says here, kauft vom blockierten Berlin, which means purchase from the blockaded Berlin. You have the planes symbols here. To commemorate the airlift, a monument was erected in front of the Tempelhof Airport, which is also in Berlin and which has its own stamp. That monument was again commemorated here in 1974, and with the flags of the 3 allies. And just as a piece of trivia, the same monument is also standing a smaller version of it near the Frankfurt airport at the entrance to the US Air Force base. If you travel on the Autobahn from Frankfurt direction Heidelberg, so going south, you could see it then on your right hand. Same item was again commemorated here. Airlift in German is called Luftbrücke. And you see then the planes. Another significant event that is commemorated by a stamp happened in 1953, in June 17. Construction workers in East Berlin started striking because their work quota were increased without a pay increase. And quickly that strike spread throughout East Germany. And you had demonstrations and strikes in all major and medium-sized towns in East Germany. And it was put down violently then by Soviet forces with tanks, and thousands were arrested, and hundreds, if not thousands, also died in prison. Now in 1961, because people were not particularly happy in East Germany and East Berlin with the regime, they kept on going west. So particularly in 1961, the statistics tell that for each month of 1961, over 100,000 people were leaving East Germany. Most of them went actually to West Berlin. There were refugee camps, and from there then most went into West Germany to block now this whole drain of East Germany. The East German government erected then this wall. As you can see, there was also then armed guards behind it. One famous picture, I don't have it here, but is that one soldier is jumping over barbed wire and disposing of his gun at the same time. Now, East Germany took a different view of it. They, however, celebrated the war they built. Now, mind you, the wall is the most visible one. As I said, the border between East and West Germany was also fortified, and not with a wall, but with fences. And anyways, here 10 years of the border is celebrated. And the term the East German government used was antifaschistischer Schutzwall, anti-fascistic protection wall. So, well, the protection wall sometimes was, at the beginning, was just the wall of a building, of an apartment building. In this case, the sidewalk is already part of East Berlin. The street proper is part of West Berlin. In the first few days, those houses were not blocked up, so people just jumped out of the window. Eventually, then the ground floor was all walled up, but then people just jumped from a second and third floor. Some made it okay, and then eventually, then those houses were demolished, and the death strip was created. This picture just shows over a wall. You have to imagine a 2-meter high wall in front here, then the area here with mines, and here there's another concrete wall, also 2 meters high, roughly, and then there's East Berlin proper. Now, the border crossings, this is actually in the early 80s, where existed many of those border crossings. Again, the major one was the checkpoint Charlie, number 5 here, and then number 2 is the Bornholmer Strasse. That's where then everything came down. Now, one important thing to know about Berlin is that the population of Berlin was growing so exponentially for various reasons. In this case here, this was before Prussia became a kingdom, but after the War of 30 Years, as I mentioned, the population of Berlin had gone down dramatically, and so did the whole area. So the ruler of the time invited refugees from France, the French Protestants who were persecuted there, the Huguenots, and established even special rules for them that they could continue their religion. Huguenots were Calvinists. Prussia was, or at the time was Brandenburg was Lutheran. So he made sure that they could keep their traditions, and which also resulted that at the beginning of the 18th century, 25% of the population of Berlin was French-speaking. The Huguenots also brought various skills along, which enriched the province and obviously also Berlin. Many words of French made their way into the Berlin dialect. So when I grew up in Berlin, I wouldn't go around the block. I just went around the carré, and also I had a parapluie, and the sidewalk was a trottoir. And if you know what a pissoir is, well, then they're still around. They still exist. There's one right next to the Huguenot church, which is right here at the Gendarmenmarkt. Wieder hier, gendarme, auch wieder, again, the French word. And that church was built in 1705 and still standing now. And it's a quite beautiful building. And dome normally in German refers to a cathedral, but in this case, it actually refers to the French word for cupola. So in English, the same, a dome. So yeah, there's also a stamp issued in Berlin. There were more refugees coming in the 18th century, this time again, Protestants from Austria. The Counter-Reformation expelled Protestants from Austria, and many of them settled then in Prussia, mostly in eastern Prussia, which is today part of Russia and Poland, but many also in Berlin. But besides them, many other refugees made their way into Berlin. Now, 1870, you mentioned the formation of the German Empire, the Second German Empire. And one thing to note there was that because Germany won the war, France had to pay reparations, and the reparations amounted to 5 billion francs, or 1.45 tons of gold, which was stored in this citadel, which goes back to Middle Ages. It's in a suburb of Berlin. It was a town that's older than Berlin, but now it's part of Berlin. Later, after World War II, it also served as a prison for Rudolf Hess, the Nazi high-ranking official. And anyways, the money here, the 1.45 tons of gold, enabled Germany to reinforce, or not to reinforce, but to boost the industrialization of the late 19th century, which led to having many factories, large factories in Berlin. Berlin, again, the population grew then exponentially because there was now also more work, and like here the picture of a locomotive manufacturing place. That's part of a drawing by Mr. Meyerheim. In those days, at the end of the 19th century, the immigration happened more from the east. So you had people come from Schlesien, or in English is Silesia, also from eastern Prussia, from western Prussia, from Pomerania. And parts of my ancestors are from Pomerania. So they were the immigrants from that region. One thing that was built because also of the growing population and the development all around Berlin was that the streets got those water pumps. Now at the time it was necessary to water horses. Eventually those pumps were quite important after World War II because some of the water supply didn't work anymore, the water supply management. However, those pumps were not connected to the water system per se. They were pumping the water straight out of the ground. And so they were supplying then the water for people living in Berlin. I remember still this type of pump in the street where I was living, and it was still working. It was fresh water and people drank it. But by then, obviously, the water pipes were working again. Now, one other thing about Berlin, this is a stamp of, or cancellation rather, of commemorating the election of the President of the Federal Republic of Germany. Now, Berliners were not allowed to vote for in the elections for the Parliament of West Germany because they were an allied governance. However, they were part of the West, and West Germany tried to show that Berlin is part of the West by having then the election of the president in Berlin. So for that, they had this cancellation. One thing that happened whenever there was this type of event or any other event that the Soviets or East Germany didn't like, supersonic flights took place over Berlin. So I remember quite well that those moments that every few minutes some plane would go over the residential area and just make sure that it was as noisy as possible. Berlin-Brandenburg Gate again. In this case, a postcard from East Germany, where they did not highlight the wall. You don't see it here anywhere, but nobody can go through. This is as close as you could get to the Brandenburg Gate in East Berlin. Down here is the Alexanderplatz, that's a main square in East Berlin, and today still a major square in Berlin. Looks a little bit different. And here you have the opera in the center of Berlin, because really the old center of Berlin was part of the Soviet zone, and you see all the Trabant. They have really only two cars, Trabant and Wartburg. Quite some interesting cars. Now, the West also used the Brandenburg Gate on their postcards. And in this case, you can see the wall. And again, here the coat of arms of Berlin. The column that commemorates the victory over the Danish forces in 1866, which honestly nobody really remembers. Everybody will know that's a victory column, but I doubt that people will really remember what war was commemorated. Castle, Schloss Charlottenburg, the castle within the city of Berlin, quite nice, housing a very beautiful museum now. This is the Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche, or the Emperor Wilhelm Memorial Church. And it was destroyed in World War II and not rebuilt. However, the church tower was built in a new form here, and then also another, the sanctuary is here. So this is now more to commemorate the devastation of World War II. And this is part of the so-called Kurfürstendamm. Here is a conference center that was a gift of the people of the United States to the people of Berlin and the Brandenburg Gate. So this conference center, Berliners refer to as the pregnant oyster. The church here is called the Hollow Tooth, or the Hohle Zahn, and the Victory Angel on top here on the column is called the Gold Else, or Gold Lizzie. So Berliners are known for making nicknames of everything and not being very well, shy about it. Another symbol, again, the memorial church. So first it was commemorated here on a stamp, on a definitive, and another, this is now a semi-postal, that shows also the church in ruins. And another time, later on in 1995, so after unification, it made its way also into the stamps of Germany. Again, to commemorate 100 years of the building of that church. And obviously you see now the ruins. And yeah, I think it's a very appropriate monument for what happened in Berlin. Another symbol of Berlin is the Funkturm, or the radio tower. So this one's standing at the exhibition grounds. And here's one that was issued for the exhibition of 1963, the Funkausstellung, which is a radio and TV show. Those were really big events, exhibitions, and they still have them. Well, okay, now with the COVID-19, obviously not, but otherwise there would be very big events going on. A travel show, car show, Grüne Woche, which is an agricultural show. They have then cows and pigs and everything there, even though Berlin itself has only maybe 24 farms still. Here, the collection of the symbols of the city together on a stamp commemorating 750 years of Berlin. And you see again the memorial church. And here's a Reichstag, the parliament building, which was restored here, Charlottenburg Schloss, the column with the Victory Angel, and the Berlin Gate, Brandenburg Gate. And this is the East German tower, at kind of a competition to the Funkturm of West Berlin. And the small little thing about this one is when the sun shines on the top of this tower, you clearly can see a cross. So Berliners refer to as the revenge of the Pope. This, by the way, is the City Hall of Schöneberg. That's where John F. Kennedy, held his speech from when he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," and that became then the de facto City Hall of West Berlin. Now, some people thought or said that when he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," that he said, "I'm a donut," but Berliner is the name for a donut in West Germany. In Berlin, he called Pfannkuchen, completely different. But in Germany, in West Germany, a Pfannkuchen would be a pancake, so it's different. But a pancake in Berlin, the German word for that in Berlin is Eierkuchen, which is something else again in West Germany. Anyways. Another symbol of Berlin, which was also commemorated in the '62 definitive series in Berlin, was the castle. This was a castle of the Prussian kings, and it was built in 1703. Remember, 1701 was the kingdom establishment of the Kingdom of Prussia. Now that castle survived more or less World War II, even though it was also burned and damaged. But the East German government decided to demolish the rest and dispose of it entirely. All the rubble was dumped in the lake, so that nothing would be left of it, so as to erase all the memory of Prussia. Now, it didn't quite work that well, and that castle has been rebuilt in the meantime. I saw it last year. It was almost finished last year, and most of the outside is now exactly how it looked before the war. So many pictures of the inside and the outside were taken. Even movies were made with them that survive. So one knows very well how it looked like. Now, Prussia still has an impact on Germany and in its memory. Now, there's one definitive that was issued still in Berlin at the time with Louise von Preußen. Now, that was a series of famous German women. Now, she was famous because in 1807, after Prussia was occupied by France, Napoleon met with her in Tilsit, which was a town in eastern Prussia, again, today part of Poland, mostly Poland. And but she was able to soften Napoleon so as that the occupation would not be as harsh as it could be. And she was referred to as a soul of natural virtue. So another item in Berlin is the Autobahn, or the AVUS. Now the AVUS, here, AVUS is an abbreviation for Autoverkehrs- und Übungsstraße. So, and that was started in 1913 and used after World War I, for longest time only as a test road. It was private, and eventually then became, however, public, and it became part of the Autobahn system of Germany. So, and it's still famous. You still can travel on parts of it today. Now, the last time was issued in 1990 for a German educator, Adolf Diesterweg. And in a way, it's appropriate that it would end with somebody who is representing the liberal part of Prussia, because he campaigned for the secularization of schools. He, he was definitely instrumental in bringing more education to the masses, to everybody, and education was important in Prussia, which led also to many people of science working in and around Berlin. At one point, Einstein was studying in Berlin, and but so many other famous people make their impact there. So, well, at the end, Berlin is not just in Germany. There are 26 Berlins in the US, I understand. So one of them is in Ohio. So if you want to go there, here they pronounce Berlin. And there's a lot of Amish around there. Kind of interesting. It's a nice place, worthwhile to visit. Thank you very much.